What if everything you believe about yourself is an illusion? From the moment we're born, we construct a self, an identity built from memories, desires, and beliefs. We crave happiness, avoid suffering, and search for meaning. But Buddhism challenges all of this with three radical ideas: impermanence, no self, emptiness. These teachings have shaped how millions view life, death, and reality itself. Some say they hold the key to true freedom. Others argue they've been misinterpreted, leading to confusion and even distortion of what the Buddha originally taught. Here's a question: which teaching is more important, emptiness or the Four Noble Truths? For many modern Buddhists, emptiness is the ultimate truth. It explains how everything is in flux, how nothing has an essence, not even you. But there's a problem. The Buddha didn't teach it this way. When he summed up his entire path, he didn't start with emptiness. He started with suffering and the way out. The Four Noble Truths. So why, after thousands of years, has the emphasis shifted? How did we go from a path of training and transformation to a belief system that often promotes passive acceptance of suffering? Tonight, we're going back to the source, to the Buddha's actual words, to uncover what he really meant when he spoke about suffering, desire, and liberation. And what you're about to discover might challenge everything you thought you knew about Buddhism. Chapter 1: Emptiness and the Four Noble Truths. For many modern Buddhists, emptiness is seen as the ultimate realization, the final truth that explains everything. Nothing has an essence. Nothing truly belongs to you. Not even your thoughts, your body, or your identity. Everything is empty, constantly shifting, and interdependent. This idea has influenced countless teachings, from Zen to Tibetan Buddhism. But what if I told you that emptiness wasn't the foundation of the Buddha's path? When the Buddha summarized his teachings in the simplest form, he didn't begin with abstract metaphysics. He said, "I teach one thing, suffering, and the end of suffering. That's it. No deep cosmic truths. No philosophical complexities. Just dukkha, suffering, stress, dissatisfaction, and how to end it." This simple yet profound insight became the foundation of the Four Noble Truths. Suffering exists because we cling. Suffering has a cause, our cravings and attachments. Suffering can end by letting go of the cause. There is a path, a method to free ourselves. But here's where things get interesting. The Buddha never described people as passive observers of reality. He saw human experience as something we actively shape, and that includes our suffering. We don't just endure suffering. We create it. And because we create suffering through our desires, thoughts, and attachments, we can also uncreate it through training the mind. That's why the Four Noble Truths are not just philosophical observations. They are a strategy. But where does emptiness fit into all this? Contrary to popular belief, the Buddha rarely spoke about emptiness as a standalone teaching. And when he did, he tied it directly to something more practical, three perceptions that reveal why we suffer and how to break free. Over time, however, these perceptions were reinterpreted. Instead of being tools to help us navigate suffering, they were turned into absolute truths about the universe. And as a result, the emphasis shifted from liberation to observation, from training the mind to merely accepting the impermanent, ever-changing nature of life. But is that really what the Buddha intended? Or have we misunderstood his original message? To find out, we need to examine these three perceptions: impermanence, suffering, and not self, and how they were originally meant to be used. Chapter 2: Impermanence, Suffering, Selflessness. We've all heard the phrase, "Nothing lasts forever." Everything changes: people, emotions, circumstances. And Buddhism teaches that understanding impermanence, anicca, is the key to inner peace. But here's the real question. If we already know that everything changes, why do we still suffer? The misinterpretation of impermanence. We've all heard the phrase, "Nothing lasts forever." It's a truth so obvious that it feels like common sense. Seasons change, people grow old, relationships end, everything is in a constant state of flux. And in Buddhism, impermanence, anicca, is often seen as the core realization that leads to freedom. The logic goes like this. We suffer because we cling to things as if they're permanent. But if we fully accept impermanence, we'll stop clinging. And once we stop clinging, we'll stop suffering. It sounds simple. Almost too simple. Because if merely understanding impermanence ended suffering, why do we still suffer? We all know life is fleeting, yet we still experience loss, disappointment, and anxiety. We know relationships won't last forever, but that doesn't stop the heartbreak when they end. We know youth fades, but that doesn't stop the fear of aging. We know success is temporary, but we still crave achievement. If impermanence itself was the problem, then simply recognizing it would be enough to set us free. Clearly, something is missing from this equation. Where the misunderstanding began. Many modern interpretations of Buddhism reduce suffering to a misunderstanding of impermanence, as if clinging is just a failure to recognize that things don't last. From this perspective, the solution seems obvious. Accept change. Flow with life. Let go of expectations. But the Buddha never said that impermanence alone is the problem. Instead, he taught something much deeper. Suffering isn't caused by impermanence itself, it's caused by how we relate to it. We don't suffer because things change. We suffer because we crave stability in an unstable world. And because we build our sense of self around things that can never be permanent, every time they shift, we feel like we're losing a part of ourselves. That's why impermanence can feel so painful. It's not just about losing things, it's about losing who we thought we were. This is a key distinction that many modern teachings overlook. When impermanence is misunderstood as simply everything changes, so just accept it, Buddhism becomes a philosophy of resignation instead of transformation. And this leads to 4 major misconceptions about clinging and suffering, misconceptions that have shaped the way many people understand Buddhism today. Let's break them down. 4 common misconceptions about clinging. Buddhism teaches that clinging is the root of suffering. But over time, many modern interpretations have simplified, or even distorted, this idea. Instead of seeing clinging as a deep mental habit that needs to be understood and uprooted, many people now believe that just recognizing impermanence is enough to solve suffering. As a result, several misconceptions have emerged, misconceptions that shape how people today understand Buddhism. These misunderstandings are so common that you might even believe them yourself. Let's break them down one by one. Misconception number 1, no self equals no control. Some people believe that because Buddhism teaches anatta, not self, it means we have no control over anything. They take this to mean we're just passive observers of reality. There's no you making decisions. Suffering happens on its own, and there's nothing you can do but accept it. From this perspective, Buddhism is reduced to detachment from all experiences. You are just a wave in the ocean. Let go. Stop trying to resist. Accept whatever comes. But the Buddha never taught passivity. He didn't say, just sit back and let life happen. He taught that we are active participants in shaping our experience. Even though the self is an illusion, our thoughts, choices, and actions still have real consequences. Think about it. If you put your hand in fire, it will burn. If you act with greed, hatred, or ignorance, it will lead to suffering. If you train the mind, it can free itself. The not-self teaching wasn't meant to make people passive. It was meant to free them from false attachments, so they could act with wisdom, not blind desire. Buddhism isn't about surrendering to life's chaos. It's about learning how to skillfully navigate it. Misconception number 2, clinging only happens when you think something is permanent. This idea seems logical. If clinging is what causes suffering, then we only cling because we mistakenly think things will last forever. So the solution? Realize that things are temporary. Enjoy them while they last. Let go when they're gone. Sounds simple, right? But here's the problem. We cling to things even when we know they're temporary. Think about it. People enter relationships knowing they'll end, but they still suffer when they do. We chase fleeting pleasures, fully aware they won't last, but we still crave them. We cling to youth, success, and identity, despite knowing they will fade. Impermanence isn't some secret knowledge we need to discover. We already know things don't last. Yet we still cling. Why? Because the problem isn't that we think things are permanent. The problem is that we depend on them for happiness. Even when we know they'll change, we still hunger for them, because we believe they will temporarily satisfy us. That's why impermanence alone isn't enough to break clinging. The real solution isn't just knowing that things change. It's training the mind to stop feeding on them for fulfillment. Misconception number 3. True wisdom is embracing the present moment without expectations. Many modern teachings reduce Buddhism to mindfulness of the present moment. The idea is, if you fully experience each moment as it arises, you won't cling. If you don't expect anything from life, you won't be disappointed. If you simply flow with whatever happens, you'll be free. There's even a popular metaphor used to describe this idea. Be like a dancer moving effortlessly with the music, never resisting change. At first, this sounds like freedom. But is it really? Or is it just making suffering more tolerable, without actually ending it? Here's the problem. You can embrace the present moment and still be caught in suffering. You can be fully mindful and still experience craving, anxiety, or attachment. You can let go of expectations and still feel emptiness inside. Because the real issue isn't expectation, it's the habit of feeding. The mind is constantly searching for something to sustain itself. It jumps from experience to experience, from pleasure to pleasure, trying to find fulfillment in things that can never provide it. Mindfulness helps, but it's not the full solution. To truly break free, the mind needs to be nourished by something beyond fleeting experiences. The Buddha didn't just teach mindfulness. He taught a path, a structured training that transforms the way we relate to experience. And that leads us to the 4th and final misconception. Misconception number 4. Clinging is just holding on to fixed views, even about Buddhism. Some people claim that any fixed belief is a form of clinging. According to this logic, if you have strong moral values, you're clinging. If you believe in right and wrong, you're clinging. If you hold on to the Buddha's original teachings, you're clinging. This perspective often leads to a relativist mindset, where nothing is truly good or bad, and all views should be abandoned. Don't hold on to ideas of right or wrong. Everything is just what it is. But here's the danger. If nothing is truly right or wrong, how do we know what leads to suffering and what leads to liberation? The Buddha wasn't vague. He didn't teach that all beliefs are clinging. He taught that some beliefs lead to suffering, while others lead to freedom. The right view, understanding the Four Noble Truths, is essential. Yes, even right view must eventually be let go of, but only after it has served its purpose. It's like a raft. If you're drowning, you need to hold onto the raft to survive. Once you reach the shore, you don't need it anymore. But if you abandon the raft too soon, you'll drown in confusion. That's why not all clinging is the same. Some attachments trap you in suffering. Others help you escape it. What this means for you: if you've believed any of these misconceptions, you're not alone. They are incredibly widespread, even among experienced practitioners. But if you truly want to break free from suffering, you need to go beyond these oversimplifications. Buddhism isn't about passively accepting everything. It's not about just being present. It's not about abandoning all views. It's about training the mind, step by step, until it no longer needs to feed on impermanent things for happiness. So how do we do that? The answer lies in three powerful insights that, when applied correctly, dismantle suffering from the inside out. And that's exactly what we're going to explore next. So what did the Buddha actually teach about clinging? At this point, we've dismantled some of the biggest misconceptions about clinging. Clinging isn't just about thinking things are permanent. Mindfulness alone isn't enough to break free. Not all attachments are equal, some actually help us reach freedom. So, what did the Buddha actually teach about clinging? It all comes down to one profound insight. Suffering is a cycle of feeding. The Buddha didn't describe clinging as a simple mental attachment. He described it as a form of feeding. And this isn't just a metaphor, it's a deep psychological pattern. Think about it. We don't just desire things. We consume them. We don't just want pleasure. We feed on it. We don't just hold on to relationships, identities, and beliefs. We nourish ourselves with them, hoping they'll sustain us. But here's the catch. Nothing we cling to can permanently satisfy our hunger. Because everything we feed on is impermanent. The joy of success? It fades. The comfort of relationships? They change. The pleasures of life? They come and go. So we keep feeding. We jump from one experience to the next, from one pleasure to the next, hoping that this time, we'll finally feel whole. But we never do. Instead, we find ourselves stuck in an endless cycle of grasping, consuming, and craving more. The Buddha called this upadana, a term that means both clinging and sustenance. It's the act of taking nourishment, not just from food, but from emotions, experiences, and identities. And because we rely on impermanent things to sustain us, suffering becomes inevitable. It's like trying to quench your thirst with salt water. The more you drink, the thirstier you become. This is why clinging leads to suffering. Not because we mistakenly think things will last forever, but because we keep feeding on things that can never provide lasting fulfillment. The two-step strategy to escape clinging. Since suffering is a cycle of feeding, the solution isn't just to let go. The Buddha offered a two-step process to break the cycle. Recognize the drawbacks of feeding, see why the things you cling to aren't worth it. Find a better source of nourishment, train the mind to be fulfilled without external dependencies. Let's take a closer look at how this works. Step 1. Recognizing the drawbacks of feeding. The first step is seeing through the illusion, not just intellectually, but deeply, at a gut level. This is where the Buddha introduced three powerful perceptions. Impermanence, anicca, everything you cling to will change. Suffering, dukkha, relying on unstable things for happiness leads to stress. not self, anatta. The things you cling to aren't truly you or yours. These aren't just abstract concepts. They are tools. When applied correctly, they help dismantle clinging at its root. Let's say you're attached to a relationship. If you see it as impermanent, you realize it won't last forever. If you see it as suffering, you recognize the stress of attachment. If you see it as not self, you understand that it doesn't define who you are. At first, this might seem sad. But the deeper you see it, the more freeing it becomes. Because it means you don't have to keep desperately holding on. But here's the problem. Even when people recognize impermanence, they often still feel empty. They say, if nothing lasts, what's the point? Where does happiness come from? That's where step 2 comes in. Step 2, finding a better source of nourishment. The Buddha understood something profound. You can't just stop feeding the mind overnight. So instead of forcing detachment, he provided a better alternative. He taught people how to replace their old sources of nourishment with something deeper. And this is where right concentration, samadhi, comes in. Instead of feeding on relationships, wealth, or fleeting pleasures, the Buddha trained people to develop a deep, stable state of inner peace. A state so fulfilling that external cravings lose their power. This is what meditation, when practiced correctly, can lead to. It's not just about relaxing or clearing the mind. It's about developing a type of happiness that isn't dependent on anything external. A happiness so stable that eventually, the mind stops needing to feed altogether. At this stage, clinging naturally fades. Because when the mind is full, it stops searching. But even here, there's one final trap. The last attachment, and how to let it go. When people first experience deep peace, they try to cling to it. They think, this is it. This is what I've been searching for. And once again, the mind starts feeding, this time, on stillness itself. This is where the final step comes in. The not-self perception is used one last time, not just to let go of the world, but to let go of the self that tries to possess even enlightenment. And when that happens, something incredible occurs. No more hunger. No more reaching. Just freedom. This is the true ending of suffering. What this means for you. The Buddha didn't teach people to just let go. He taught them how to let go, by seeing deeply into the nature of clinging and replacing it with something better. This is why the Four Noble Truths must come first. Because they provide the roadmap, not just for observing life, but for actively freeing yourself from suffering. But this raises an even bigger question. If the Buddha taught this so clearly, why has modern Buddhism shifted away from it? Why do so many teachings today emphasize emptiness over the path to liberation? The answer lies in the shift in Buddhist philosophy over time. And that's what we're going to explore in our final chapter. Chapter 3, Utilizing 3 Perceptions to End Clinging. At this point, we've uncovered something crucial. Suffering isn't just about impermanence. It's about how we feed on things, relationships, success, beliefs, even our own identity, to feel whole. And as long as we rely on external things to satisfy this hunger, we will suffer. So how do we break free? The Buddha didn't just tell people to stop clinging. He gave them a method. A strategy. The 2-step strategy to end clinging. To escape suffering, the Buddha taught 2 essential steps. See through the illusion, recognize why the things you cling to aren't worth it. Find a better source of nourishment, train the mind to feed on something deeper, until it no longer needs to feed at all. Let's break these down. Step 1, Seeing through the illusion. The Buddha introduced 3 powerful perceptions, often mistaken as rigid truths, but actually meant to shift the way we see the world. These are impermanence, anicca, everything changes, nothing lasts. Suffering, dukkha, what is unstable leads to stress. Not self, anatta, the things we cling to aren't truly us or ours. At first glance, these seem obvious. But when applied correctly, they completely dismantle our attachments. Let's take an example. Imagine eating your favorite meal. You know it won't last forever. You know the pleasure fades. But that doesn't stop you from craving it. So what if, instead of just acknowledging that the food is temporary, you actually focused on the cycle itself? You'd realize the pleasure from eating is temporary. The hunger will return. The search for satisfaction never ends. And suddenly, it's not about whether the food itself is impermanent. It's about whether it's actually worth the effort of clinging to it. This is what the Buddha meant by not self. It's not a metaphysical statement, it's a value judgment. You see that clinging to these things isn't worth it. And when the mind truly understands this, it starts to let go. But here's the problem. Letting go isn't enough. Because if you don't replace the old attachments with something better, you'll just find new things to cling to. That's where step 2 comes in. Step 2, finding a better source of nourishment. The Buddha understood something radical. You can't stop feeding the mind overnight. So instead of trying to force detachment, he provided a new kind of nourishment, one that's not based on external things. This is where right concentration, samadhi, comes in. Instead of feeding on relationships, wealth, or fleeting pleasures, the Buddha taught people to develop a deep, stable state of inner fulfillment. When the mind experiences true stillness, it no longer needs to cling to external things for happiness. It's like switching from junk food to a healthy diet. Eventually, the craving for unhealthy things fades away. But even here, there's a trap. Because when people first experience this deep peace, they try to cling to it. They think, this is it. This is what I've been searching for. And the mind, conditioned to feed, tries to possess even the deathless. That's why the final step is crucial. The last attachment, and how to let it go. The Buddha's final teaching wasn't just about letting go of external things. It was about letting go of the act of clinging itself. This is where the not-self perception is used one last time, not just to let go of the world, but to let go of the self that tries to possess even enlightenment. And when that happens, something incredible occurs. No more hunger. No more reaching. Just freedom. This is the true ending of suffering. But this raises an even bigger question. Why have so many modern teachings moved away from this framework? And what happens when we prioritize emptiness over the Four Noble Truths? The answer lies in understanding the shift in Buddhist philosophy over time. Let's explore that in our final chapter. The Four Noble Truths must come first. So, how did we get here? Why has modern Buddhism moved from a path of training and transformation to one that often preaches passive acceptance? Why have so many people come to believe that just observing impermanence and emptiness is enough, instead of actively following a path to freedom? The answer lies in a shift in priorities. At some point, Buddhism's teachings moved from being a method for overcoming suffering to a philosophy about the nature of reality. Instead of seeing impermanence, suffering, and not-self as tools to free the mind, they became absolute truths, statements about how the world is, rather than strategies for transformation. And because of this shift, many now see Buddhism as a philosophy of resignation, rather than a strategy for true freedom. But the Buddha never taught people to merely accept suffering. He didn't just say, "Everything changes. Don't get attached. He didn't just teach. The self is an illusion. Let go of your identity. Instead, he taught. Suffering has a cause, and there's a path to end it. That's why the Four Noble Truths must always come first. They provide the roadmap, the structured path that tells you what to do rather than just what to believe. The raft versus the shoreline. Imagine you're caught in a flood. The waters are rising, the current is pulling you downstream, and in the distance, you see a solid, safe shore. The Buddha described this flood as the suffering of life, the constant cycle of craving, clinging, and dissatisfaction. And he didn't just say, accept the water. Watch the waves. He said, here's a raft. Get on it. Row. Reach the other side. That raft is the Noble Eightfold Path. Right view. Right intention. Right speech. Right action. Right livelihood. Right effort. Right mindfulness. Right concentration. It's a process of training the mind, not just to accept suffering, but to end it. The problem with prioritizing emptiness over the path. Now, imagine someone sitting on the shore, watching the waves. They tell you, don't resist the water. Just observe it. That's what happens when emptiness is prioritized over the Four Noble Truths. Instead of focusing on crossing the river, it teaches you to just watch the waves. And while that might bring some peace, it doesn't lead to real liberation. True Buddhism isn't about floating in the water, it's about getting to the other side. The danger of misunderstanding not-self. The same problem applies to not-self, anatta. Some people claim that having any belief, moral value, or goal is a form of clinging. That if you try to train the mind or work toward enlightenment, you're still trapped in attachment. But the Buddha never rejected effort. In fact, he taught that wisdom begins with the question, what, when I do it, will lead to my long-term happiness? This is why the Four Noble Truths are so powerful. They don't just tell you to let go. They teach you how to let go, and what to replace your old attachments with. What does this mean for you? So now, you have a choice. You can follow the modern, distorted version of Buddhism, the one that tells you to simply observe life, accept impermanence, and let go of all fixed views. Or you can follow the Buddha's original path, the one that gives you the tools to actively break free from suffering. Because one of these leads to true liberation, and the other? It leaves you stranded. If this changed how you see Buddhism, let me know in the comments. And if you want to dive deeper into the Buddha's original teachings, be sure to subscribe, because there's a lot more to uncover.